So in today's episode, I'm going to be showing you guys how to edit your photos to look more cinematic in Adobe Lightroom. Now, this is a topic I get asked about all the time here on Instagram and Twitter, and it's been a long time since I made an editing episode, so here we go. Now, before we get into Lightroom, I want to briefly talk about and clarify what I mean by cinematic photography and editing your photos in a cinematic way. It's a pretty loose term. It gets used all the time on social media and here on YouTube, and it can mean a million different things, to be honest. For me, a cinematic photo is simply a photograph which either conveys an emotion, tells a story, or looks like it could have been lifted out of a Hollywood film or a film you'll see in a cinema. Now, even that last point there is very subjective because films look completely different to each other. In my case, I like to base my cinematic edits on films like Terminator 2, or the original Blade Runner, or the Batman, Joker, those kind of films which really have that old school cinematic feel to them. But basically, it's the type of films I like to watch, and I like to recreate that look in my own photography. But yeah, let's cut to the chase and start editing on Lightroom. Okay, so we are over in Adobe Lightroom. This is the first photo I'm gonna edit. This one here was taken in London, Soho. Taken last year, one of my favorite shots from the year, and it was taken on the Fujifilm 50mm f2 on the X Pro 2. So as you can see here, I posted this on Instagram. One of my favorite shots. It also sold as an NFT for 1 Ethereum. But let's get back to Lightroom here. Before we start the edit, on the left here is my cinematic preset pack. I pretty much start all of my edits using this preset pack. It allows me to keep my edits looking more consistent, and secondly, it saves me time as well. For those of you interested, I'll drop the link to this down below in the description. But let's get started on today's edit. And the first thing to remember when it comes to editing photos to look cinematic is film has a much smaller dynamic range than modern digital cameras do. So what you see in cinema is the scenes usually don't have as much dynamic range as you'll see in photography. So the first thing you want to do is look at the histogram, and you want to kind of compress the histogram so most of the values end up on the left hand side. Now the first thing I pretty much always do is bring down the highlights and bring down the whites. As you can see, this moves all the values to the left hand side of the histogram. Now what you have to remember is when you move down the highlights and the whites, you often have to compensate by moving the exposure back up. Next up, I will play with the shadows and blacks in order to balance the image out a bit. There's always a delicate balance between moving the shadows up and moving the blacks down to maintain that contrast, but also bringing out details from the shadows. So once I've got my image correctly exposed, I will get back up to the white balance and play around with the white balance. I also like to reduce the contrast. It produces a more flatter image. I also like to bring down the clarity. Digital cameras, in my opinion, are far too sharp to give that cinematic look. So I like to bring the clarity down. I bring the dehaze down a tiny bit as well. I do like to add a bit of texture in just to maintain some detail in the image. But yeah, so this is the starting point. We've reduced the dynamic range, we brought the highlights down, we boosted the shadows a bit. I'll play with the basic adjustments a little bit more until I get them about right before moving down to the tone curve and the colors. Another thing I like to do with my cinematic edits is to boost the vibrance and bring the saturation down a bit. It's also worth noting, for those of you who use Fujifilm, I do like using their camera profiles. And for my cinematic edits, I do tend to go for either classic chrome or for pro negative high. But for this episode, I'm going to stick to Adobe Color so that everyone watching can learn how to edit these photos in a cinematic way regardless of which camera you're using. So let's head down to the tone curve here. Now before I mess around with the tone curve, I go into the color channels first, and I always hold the option key on Mac when it comes to moving the tone curve around. It just allows you to have a lot more control. And I like to push some blues into the shadows and then move some warmer tones into the highlights. So this differs for every single image. You kind of have to play it by eye each time you do it. I also like adding some greens into the shadow and some purples into the highlights. And yeah, after that I head into the main tone curve here. Now normally I add a bunch of points across the tone curve, and just like with the basic adjustments, we're looking to flatten the dynamic range in this image. So the first thing I do is bring up the shadows and reduce the highlights. Alright, so I'm kind of happy with the tone curve. Both with the basic adjustments and the tone curve, I'm always making adjustments to it throughout the edit. Alright, so next up, let's get down to the HSL, the colors. Now this plays a massive role in your images looking cinematic or not. I do highly recommend you looking into color science and learning about color in detail. So colors can, one, make your images look more cinematic, but two, they can help convey emotions and stories as well. So it's really important to grasp a really good understanding of color. And the first thing you probably should do is pick up a color wheel and kind of base your edits using the color wheel and kind of color schemes which are already used in cinema. So what you can see in this image is there's lots of yellows and greens and blues. So they're going to be the main colors to play with and get right in order to get this image looking more cinematic. An easy way to make things look a bit more cinematic is to reduce the amount of colors on screen. As you can see here, there's greens on the left hand side of the image. So rather than keeping those as greens, you kind of push those into the yellows. Alright, so once I've got the colors about where I want them, I head back down to the color grading. So this is a new feature on Adobe Lightroom, and it's a really powerful feature. It allows you to pinpoint exactly which colors you want to inject into the highlights, shadows and midtones, and this makes it much easier than it was before to give your images a more cinematic look. Now what I like to do for my edits is push some more warmer tones into the highlights, and then into the shadows I like to push some cooler tones. So again, like with the colors, you have to base this all on eye. It changes from image to image. And to be honest, the color grading probably takes me the longest when it comes to editing photos. Also for global, I like to add a little bit of green into the image as well. Once the color grading is done, I head back into the HSL to make some minor adjustments, and then after that I head back into the basic adjustments. Alright, so next up, let's get down to effects. An easy way to make your images look more cinematic is to add a vignette and also add some grain to the image. This is simply because a lot of old films were shot in film, and film has grain in it. And most older camera lenses had a natural vignette to them as well. So after I get to this point, I head down to camera calibration and I play with the values here until I get to colors exactly where I want them to be. Again, once I've made some adjustments to calibration, I head back up to HSL to make some more minor adjustments as well. So at this point, once I've got my colors right, and I've got my basic adjustments right, I head over to the brush tool and I start making some more specific adjustments to the image. Alright, so that just about wraps up this edit here. Here's the before, here's the after, and as I said earlier, before I do post this to Instagram or social media, I'll take some time away from the screen, I'll come back to it and make some more changes that way. Okay, so here is the second image we're going to edit in today's episode. So this one's very different, taken at daytime in Istanbul under sunlight, taken on the Fujifilm X-T4 with the 35mm f1.4. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do again is use the basic adjustment sliders to reduce the amount of dynamic range in this image. So this was one of my favorite shots from Istanbul, and the subject in frame, the emotion he's conveying, it really allows the viewer to attach a story to this image. So when it comes to capturing cinematic photography, and for you, when you want to capture more cinematic looking photos, something you can always look for is people displaying emotions. I have a whole episode where I get into a bit more detail in this, which I'll link down below. Just like with the previous image, I'm going to bring down the clarity and the dehaze. I'm also going to reduce the contrast to flatten the image. Okay, with the basic adjustments done, I'm heading down to the tone curve. Alright, so let's head down to the tone curve to make some more adjustments to the image. Using the tone curve probably is one of the most time consuming parts of editing. You can spend hours just moving each of these points around until you get them exactly where you want them. So once I'm happy with the tone curve, I'm moving down to the HSL to play around with the colors. So with this image here, as you can see, the reds and the yellows play a prominent role, and then in the shadows there's slight hints of blue. So once I'm happy with the colors here, I'm going to move down to the color grading. Again, I'm pushing some warmer tones into the highlights and cooler tones into the shadows. With an image like this where there's already so much warmth in the image generated by the sun, I use a lot less of the warm tones in the highlights, and instead I focus more on bringing some cooler tones into the shadows. When it comes to sharpening and details, I don't like to over sharpen my images. If anything, I bring it around to the 40 mark. I'll move the radius up a tiny bit depending on the image. Again, when you're moving any of these values, hold the option key down, and that way you can see exactly what differences you're making to your image. Also, what's important when it comes to sharpening is to move the masking all the way up. Hold the option key and drag the masking slider up, and you can see exactly which parts of the image you are sharpening. One thing I like to do is when I'm adding grain to my image, I like to zoom in, make sure I'm not adding so much grain where it takes away the details from the photo. Again, once I've done the calibration, I'm heading back up to the HSL and the basic adjustments to make some more minor adjustments to this image. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this edit as well. Now, as I said in the previous photo, and when it comes to making all of your images look more cinematic, a major part of it is reducing that dynamic range and getting the colors right. Now, a technique I use and I highly recommend is find a film you like, find a scene out of that film which kind of resembles your image, and see how the color grading is on that film and recreate it in your own image. That way you can kind of get used to seeing what types of colors are used in cinema, and then you can start recreating those in your own work. So the main pointers are reduce the dynamic range and get those colors right. Secondly, when it comes to the effects, adding in things like vignettes and grain can really, again, help enhance your image and make them look more cinematic. Okay, so that's how I edit my cinematic street photos on Lightroom. As I said earlier, I have a cinematic preset pack on sale on my website. You by no means need presets to edit. You can start all of your edits from scratch, that's totally fine. I like to use presets because they save me time. I start all of my edits using my own preset pack from the same point, and that allows me 1, to save time, and 2, to keep my work more consistent. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit that thumbs up button, and if you haven't already, remember to hit the subscribe as well. We got up to 11,000 subscribers over the past week, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of your support. If you have any questions about today's episode or cinematic editing in general, drop those down in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to you. A huge thanks for watching today's episode, stay safe, and I'll catch you in the next one.